Daniel, you're on mute.
Sorry, I thought I changed that. Good evening, and welcome to Moravian College for the third Tagore lecture. My name is Daniel Jasper. I'm the Dean of the School of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences here at Moravian. I want to first make sure that everyone's aware that tonight's presentation will be recorded. And for those of you who are new to the Zoom webinar platform, I want to provide a very brief overview. After the presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. To pose a question, you can use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. These will be monitored throughout the lecture this evening and will be asked of the speaker afterwards. It may not be possible to ask all of the questions that are posed, but we will do our best. If you're experiencing any difficulty with the technology or anything else, you can use the chat function also at the bottom of the screen to communicate with the panelists. I would now like to introduce Provost Cynthia Casso, who will say a few words of welcome.
Thank you everyone for coming, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here. I'm giving this welcome on behalf of Dr. President Brian Grigsby, because for technical reasons, he's not able to actually speak to you. But I'm so happy that you're all here viewing this, this presentation. I thank everybody for participating in the lecture. Thanks especially to Dr. Arup Sengupta for funding the lecture series at Moravian College. Thank you also to Eric Weiner for agreeing to be our speaker this year. We're looking forward to hearing more about your experience and your knowledge of Tagore's life. This is a new format, as Dr. Jasper mentioned, and we hope to resume in person for the lecture next year. Fingers crossed, and more than that. And now let me turn it over to Dr. Arup Sengupta for some brief remarks about the life of Tagore. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
You can hear me, but is my video on?
Your video is not on, but we can hear you.
Which one here?
Yeah.
Okay. And this part. Good. Good evening, everybody. So I believe you can all hear me out, can see me too. But in all these technical matters, we have some helping hands all the time, whom we lovingly call graduate students. So he just rescued me. Good evening again, but at the same time, I know that there are people now in Bangladesh, India, some in China, and some in Russia who have joined, and some are still struggling. It is very early in the morning there, so my heartfelt good morning. I know there are two people in England, and it is just exactly the midnight, but I refuse to say good night. We, over here at Moravian College, launched this distinguished Tagore lecture series 4 years ago. And this is on a global platform because Rabindranath Tagore, by all means, really belongs to the world. I would give a very simple example to substantiate my point. Rabindranath Tagore passed away in 1941. 6 years after his death, India became independent. India, which is a secular but predominantly Hindu country, took one of his poem songs as its national anthem. In 1971, Bangladesh became independent. It's a predominantly Muslim country. It too took one of his another song as its national anthem. A third song, which was not written by Rabindranath Tagore, by one of his students in the academic institution which he founded, later became the national anthem of Sri Lanka, which is a predominantly Buddhist country. So one can very quickly see, that Tagore truly belongs to the world, because all these people in different countries, they didn't accept Tagore as a Hindu or a Bengali or an Indian. He was a friend, he was a well-wisher, and he was a true citizen of the world. In this particular occasion, I would make a very sincere request that some of you, or all of you probably, have watched the slide deck. It ran 10 minutes longer, so you cannot escape it. There is a poem there. The title is Where the Mind is Without Fear. This is the most celebrated poem of his Nobel Prize winning Gitanjali. Words can make transformative change. This particular poem has been used by Nobel Prize winners in their acceptance speeches, by Hollywood stars when they were launching some humanitarian movement, by Silicon Valley inventors when they were claiming their invention is going to have a global impact, and also by judges, for fair justice. So please somehow collect that one. It is readily available. Share it with your children, with your nephews, nieces, cousins, friends, uncles, grandpas, grandmas. This lecture shouldn't be just one night stand with Tagore, and this particular poem can go a long way, because at the end, we, the human beings on this planet, in spite of all our differences in ethnicity, religion, language, political beliefs, are much more the same than we are different. And together, we all have only one place to live, which we call planet Earth. And that's why Rabindranath Tagore is very pertinent. And at Moravian College, we'll continue with this distinguished Tagore lecture series in the future. Thank you all for joining in. I'll now hand over to Dean Daniel Jasper, who will introduce the speaker of the event. Thank you all again.
I want to begin by thanking Arup Sengupta for his very generous support over the years for this important lecture series to honor and celebrate the work of Tagore. Moravian is proud to be a partner in this work, and we look forward to continuing this partnership in the future. And it's my pleasure now to introduce our speaker. Eric Weiner is an author who began his career as a journalist, but neither journalist nor author really begin to describe his work. Eric is a prolific traveler and a perpetual thinker, who through his writing explores the power of ideas, the importance of place, and the pragmatics of how we choose to live our lives in the 21st century. His best-selling books, translated now into over 20 languages, include The Geography of Bliss, Man Seeks God, The Geography of Genius, and his most recent book, The Socrates Express, In Search of Life Lessons from Dead Philosophers. These engaging works are difficult to categorize. They are part reportage, part travelogue, and part philosophical essay. The books invite the reader to discover new people, places, and ideas. More importantly, Eric shows how distant places, historic thinkers, and distinct cultural frameworks are relevant to our lives today. Eric Weiner has reported from many countries. He's been a reporter for the New York Times and was a foreign correspondent for National Public Radio. He has also contributed to the BBC, the Washington Post, and many other publications. He also regularly leads writing workshops in both Arizona and Bhutan. I'm sure that many of us would be interested in joining one of these in the near future. So please join me in welcoming Eric Weiner to Moravian College as we embark on a journey to South Asia to learn about the ideas and continuing relevance of Rabindranath Tagore.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Daniel, for that generous introduction. Thank you, Arup, and thank you to the provost all for your kind words. I hope everyone can hear and see me okay. And I know you have a choice. You can watch me or you can watch President Biden talk about the stimulus package, and you've chosen to listen to me talk about Rabindranath Tagore, and I am very grateful for that. And I do hope that next time we can get together in person. A confession first, I am not a Tagore scholar. I do not have a PhD in Tagore studies. At the end of this hour or so how we have together, you will not be an expert on Tagore, whatever that means. But I am a Tagore enthusiast. And as Daniel said, I am a traveler, and I like to think of myself as a philosophical traveler. For many years, I was a foreign correspondent with NPR. And my first posting, they say you never forget your first posting, was to India. And foreigners who come to India have one of two reactions. They either love it or they hate it. I loved it. Mera dil Hindustani hai. My heart is Indian, at least a part of my heart is. And I continue to come back to India almost every year except for this past year. And yet, I never somehow made it to Calcutta, as it was called, or Kolkata today, during my time as a foreign correspondent. The truth is that that part of India had fallen off the map a little bit. Then years later, I'm working on a book called The Geography of Genius, and I finally make it to Calcutta, or Kolkata as it's now known. And that is where I encounter Rabindranath Tagore in his fullness, is in the city that he was born and the part of India where he thrived and where he lived. And I am a person that really believes in the power of place, that place matters, that where we are shapes who we are. And this is a theme you're going to hear throughout my talk as we discover what we can learn from Rabindranath Tagore. Now, with the magic of technology, I'm going to push a few buttons here and probably just like cut myself offline. No, I'm just kidding. I am going to push a few buttons here. Just bear with me, please. Okay, that's not what you're supposed to see, but we will get there. Okay, and you should see a picture of a man who looks an awful lot like Dumbledore from Harry Potter. That was my first impression when I saw this picture, and it's still my impression today. Looks like Dumbledore's lost twin. A Japanese man who met him years ago described Tagore as looking like some sort of ancient Oriental wizard. And that is what he looks like. Of course, he was much more. So let's start with the pop quiz. Arup sort of gave you a little sneak and peek into what the questions I might ask. But let's do a quick pop quiz with poll question number 1. Can we get that up, please? There we go. Rabindranath Tagore was which of the following? And this is, you know, a non-credit sort of thing, so you can get it wrong. It doesn't matter. A, the first Asian to win the Nobel Prize. B, the only person to compose 2 national anthems. C, popularizer of the term Mahatma, or great soul, to describe Gandhi. Or D, all of the above. And I feel like we should play the Jeopardy theme song now. Oh, how does that go? Okay, I will wait for some answers to come up, but Arup did give you a little hint about what the answer might be. I'm about to give away the answer here. And the answer is, of course, all of the above. But that doesn't really describe Tagore. It doesn't really tell us about the man. It doesn't really tell us about his soul. And so what I want to do is try to get the essence of him. Now, my talk is called Why Tagore Matters Now More Than Ever. And really what I mean is why he matters to you. And you might be wondering, what can I possibly learn from this long dead Indian dude about life? And the answer is quite a lot. I'm always looking for the practical aspect in my books. I'm looking for, I want to say the takeaway, but I don't love that term, the life lessons from places and from people. So I'm going to give you 10 life lessons from not just the writings of Rabindranath Tagore, but from the life of Tagore. So let's get going. Lesson number 1, be born in the right place at the right time. Now, I do mean that a little bit tongue-in-cheek because we don't choose where we're born or when we're born, but it does matter. And it mattered to Tagore. It made Tagore Tagore. And really, life lesson number 1, be born in the right place at the right time, speaks directly to this big question. Where does genius come from? It's a question I explore in my book, The Geography of Genius, at length, and I want to dispel some myths about genius and where it comes from. And Rabindranath Tagore was by all means a genius. But myth number 1 is that geniuses are born. Think of Mozart. He's the poster child for this myth about geniuses are born, because Mozart was, you know, playing the violin at age 3, composing music at age 7. He must have been born that way, right? Well, that ignores the fact that he was born in a musical place, Austria, in a musical time in the 18th century, into a very musical family. His father was the premier violin instructor of Europe at the time. In fact, researchers are finding that the genetic component in genius is actually quite small, about 20%. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter as much as we think we do. Myth number 2 is that geniuses are made through hard work. This is the 10,000 hour rule. You may have heard about this. It's the idea that you need to put in at least 10,000 hours into whatever field it is you're working in order to achieve mastery, if not genius. Now, hard work matters, but there are plenty of hardworking people in, I don't know, North Korea with lots of good genes, but you don't hear about a lot of geniuses coming out of North Korea. So I want to propose to you my own theory. What if geniuses aren't made? What if they're not born? What if they are grown in the soil? Then the soil matters very much. You wouldn't expect to grow a flower or an apple tree in concrete. You need to have the right soil, the right environment. And in fact, if you were to look at a map of the world and you were to plot the appearance of geniuses throughout history and around the world, you wouldn't see random appearances like, 1 in La Paz, 1 in Cairo, and 3 in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. No, what you see is something more like this. I call them genius clusters. Certain places at certain times have produced just a motherlode of brilliant minds and good ideas. And the question that I set out to research in this book, The Geography of Genius, is what was in the water in those places, and can we bottle it? What can we learn from these places? And the first thing we learn is that almost all of them are cities. There's something about a city that produces geniuses. If it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a city to make a genius. It's been said that cities are where ideas go to have sex. And I won't get into that too much other than to say the idea is there are interactions in cities, interaction opportunities. If you think of a container with molecules in it, if you have just a few molecules, you have a few chances for new combinations being formed. If you have lots of molecules moving around at a fast speed, you have more possibilities, interaction opportunities, they're called. And one of these cities is Calcutta. And I'm going to use the name Calcutta because that's what it was known back in the 19th century, even though it's Kolkata today. This is the flower market in Calcutta, by the way. And the first thing you notice when you come to Calcutta is it is a chaotic place, even by Indian standards. And I'll get to that in a minute. But it's into this milieu that Tagore is born. Now, he didn't create the Bengal Renaissance, as this genius cluster is known, but he was more the flower, the fruit of it, the offspring. He contributed to it, but he was not the first to come along and to sprout in it. And he recognized that he was living in a special place, in a special time. And I want to just read a brief quote from him, looking back at his life and his childhood. He said, "Something undreamt of was lurking everywhere, and every day the uppermost question was, when, oh, when would I come across it?" So that sense of wonder, and again, the sense of chaos. And there's no other word for it. This is Sutter Street. My hotel was on Sutter Street there, if you don't believe me, Sutter Street. And I'm sitting in the hotel bar. It's an old hotel called the Fairlawn, and it's outside, and there's a little beer garden. I'm having a beer with a Irish photographer named TJ. And TJ keeps coming back to Calcutta every year, year after year. And it's a difficult city in many ways. I mean, wonderful, but difficult. It's not easy. And I asked TJ why he keeps coming back. And he said something I'll never forget. He said, the possibility of coincidence is greater here than it is elsewhere. The possibility of coincidence is greater here than it is elsewhere. Tagore knew this too. He said, it is the element of unpredictability in art that seems to fascinate me strongly, that sense of unpredictability. And in physics, we know that chaotic systems are sort of necessary to go from one system of order to another. They're known as a bifurcation point. You think of a stream going down, running along, and it's on its one course, but it hits a boulder, and then it bifurcates. and heads off in a new direction. Those bifurcation points are chaotic places like Calcutta. So you could say that Tagore was lucky to be born in the time and place that he was. But as Louis Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind. And Tagore was absolutely prepared to embrace the chaos. He was prepared because of not only the city he grew up in, but in the family he grew up in. The Tagore family, they were wealthy, and they grew up in this compound. It's now a museum called Jurasanko. He was the youngest of 15 children. They were wealthy. The grandfather in particular made a fortune. They were in all kinds of businesses, in the real estate business. But Tagore from early on recognized the double-edged nature of wealth. He said, when material is in profusion, the mind gets lazy. And he also said the world of play is spoiled for the unfortunate youngster who is burdened with an unlimited quantity of playthings. And this is a theme that I would pick up on in my book, the idea that actually creative genius is a response to constraints, to limited resources. So he's growing up in this house, youngest of 15, and it is just drenched in culture. We wrote, we sang, we acted, we poured ourselves out on every side, Tagore writes. But it's not just any kind of culture, it's a mix of East and West. So you would, if you were to time travel back to Jurasanko, this compound of the 19th century, in eavesdrop, you would hear Vedic chants mingling with Shakespeare. Not clashing, but mingling. This was a hybrid household. The Tagores were great wisdom foragers, I call them. They were looking for wisdom wherever they could find it. They even developed their own dialect that the family spoke. Now, lest you think this was some sort of paradise, it was not. Tagore was lonely. His mother died when he was young. His father was often away on business. He was extremely lonely, and he lived during a time that was, in fact, difficult in similar ways to our time. It was a time of pandemic and disease. First smallpox when he was growing up, later a terrible outbreak of bubonic plague, and then the Spanish flu of 1918 that definitely affected India as well. Millions died. Tagore lost, in I think 1905 it was, he lost his wife and 2 children. He lost his sister-in-law he was very fond of to suicide. These were difficult times. But again, creativity is a response, a resourceful response to constraints. You know, Robert Frost, the poet, once said that free verse poetry, you know, anything goes poetry, is like playing tennis without a net. We need those constraints. And lots of studies show that when we're presented with constraints to sort of build a collage or whatever it is, give us fewer materials, give us a deadline, and we're likely to produce something more creative. And I want to talk a bit about the loneliness and sadness of Tagore. And I'm going to relate it to Iceland, of all places. I'm in Iceland researching my first book, The Geography of Bliss, and I meet this composer named Hilmar. And Hilmar seems very happy, yet he's very creative, and his music is very haunting and sad. And I said, Hilmar, what's going on? You're happy, yet your music is beautiful and very melancholic. What's going on? He said, well, I am happy, but I cherish my melancholia. Cherish my melancholia. And I think Tagore would 100% agree with that. He was not a happy-go-lucky person. He recognized the value and the beauty of transforming human suffering into art. So let's move along. We're going to pick up the pace now with life lesson number 3, doodle. It's a great word, doodle. I think I just like saying doodle, doodle, doodle. To doodle, in my mind, is to experiment, to play, to have fun. And that's what Tagore did. He was not, you know, a particularly good student. He was, in fact, a terrible student. He never graduated, never got a degree except for honorary degrees, but he doodled. He played around in the margins of his poem. For instance, this is an actual photo of one of his poems, and you can see he's doodling away, filling in the verses, having fun, and it was this doodling that actually led to his interest much later in life, which we'll get to, in painting. So you never know where this doodling will lead you. Life lesson number 4 from Tagore, be open to experience. Now, this is the one trait that psychologists have found all creative geniuses have. They're open to experience. Not so much broadcasters as receivers. And it sounds simple, be open to experience, but most of us are not really open to experience. We have certain ideas in our mind and we don't change them very often. Tagore was constantly revising his poems, for instance. He would change his verse style every 5 years, for instance, always experimenting and always open to experience. Everything comes to us that belongs to us if we create the capacity to receive it. We're not inventing this creativity, we're receiving it, is how Tagore saw it. And I think there's great wisdom in that. He recounts in his memoir how as a child, and he was really raised by servants, let's be honest, his father's away, his mother's dead, they would draw a chalk circle around him and warn him about the dangers of crossing it. So he listened to them because he was afraid, but that physical confinement, again, constraints, made him hugely curious about what lay outside that world. And the way he learned about that world, well, one way was by reading. He was self-taught. He was a voracious reader. He read in several languages, read everything he could get his hands on. That's him on the left. And you can see he was a good-looking guy. I mean, he was born at a time, and I always feel sorry for these people who are born just when photography is coming online. And all the only pictures we have of them is when they're old, because photography didn't exist very much when they were young. But he was a tall man and a handsome man. And I'm getting off track. He's got a book in his hand that he's reading. And the Bengalis, he's Bengali, of course, they love books. That's a contemporary picture of College Street in Calcutta. And if you're a book lover like me, you just fall in love with this place. It's just heaven. Bookstall after bookstall, bookstore after bookstore everywhere. During the Bengal Renaissance, we're talking the 19th century, there were more books published in Calcutta than any place in the world except for London. And the Bengalis are one of the few cultures in the world to have a specific ceremony, a kind of ritual for children as they draw their first letters. It's called Hatakori. And to me, it speaks volumes about what matters in Bengali culture. And again, this is where Tagore came from. He's growing up out of this environment. And another way he is experiencing the world is through travel. He was like me, he had a severe case of wanderlust. Let's put it that way. He traveled to some 30 countries on 5 continents, which back then was not so easy. Here he is in Tokyo, as it says Tagore in Tokyo. And he went to Japan, to China, to Europe, to the US. And it opened his eyes to other ways of being. And I think he was once asked why he traveled, and he said something very interesting. He said, in order to see better. I read that, and then I came across a quote from Henry Miller, the American writer, very similar. Miller was asked about travel, and he said that one's destination is never a place, but a new way of looking at things. So both Miller and Tagore are coming at travel the same way. And it's frankly my approach to travel and why I do what I do and write the books I do. It's not to lie on the beach. I like beaches as much as everyone, or to go hiking in the mountains. That's fine. It's really this new way of seeing things. And he was open to other cultures. He said, I have no distrust of any culture because of its foreign character. On the contrary, I believe that the shock of outside forces is necessary for maintaining the vitality of our intellect, the shock of outside forces. So he exposed himself to that on a regular basis, which brings us to number 5, talk to strangers. Tagore would talk to anyone. He talked to ordinary people, and he talked to people like Mohandas Gandhi, now known as Mahatma Gandhi and known as Mahatma Gandhi or Gandhiji, largely because of Tagore, who popularized that use of the title Mahatma, which means great soul. Now, in this photo, you notice that they're not looking at each other. And there's a reason for that. They didn't get along so well. I mean, they got along personally, but they disagreed. And they disagreed over issues of nationalism and the independence movement. They disagreed over technology. Gandhi thought that India's future lay in its villages and simple traditional technologies like the charkha, which is a spinning wheel. Gandhi thought every Indian should spend 30 minutes on the spinning wheel, the charkha, every day. Tagore thought that was ridiculous. The takeaway, I think, from this is they disagreed, but they remained friends. You know, Gandhiji always said that he had many opponents, but no enemies. You know, and he thought that your opponent is a potential friend and you never treat them as an enemy. You're not trying to destroy them, you're trying to convert them. I think we could all, in our political discourse today, learn a lot from both of these men who disagreed, but remained friends. And he met with Einstein. This looks like a meeting of the Bad Hair Club, which I would love to be a member of the Bad Hair Club or the Good Hair Club or just any hair club, you know, it'd be nice. But also, they're looking past each other. They're meeting in Berlin in 1930. A relative of Einstein's at the time described Tagore as the poet with the head of a thinker and Einstein as the thinker with the head of a poet. And he added that the conversation, he said, was as though two planets were engaged in a chat, but two planets in asynchronous orbit, right? Because they're not fully agreeing. So let's go to our next poll question, number 2, should be about Einstein. If we could pull that up. Okay, question for contestants out there. You are having coffee with Albert Einstein in Berlin. It's 1930. What do you ask him? A, do you take cream with that? B, how is it possible for light to be both wave and particle? C, do truth and beauty exist independent of human consciousness? Or D, what's up with the hair? Okay, take a minute to answer the question there. We've made it tough. This one's not so easy. I'm going to give you a minute and wait for something to pop up on my screen. Okay. Do we have an answer or a common answer from people? I'm curious what people said. And there we go. Answers in. And do you take cream with that? 3%. I admire the people who said that. What's up with the hair? 7%. 25% about possible for light to be both wave and particle. And the 65% about truth and beauty. Correct, you 65%ers. That is what they talked about. And Tagore was of the mind that both truth and beauty only existed in human consciousness, not outside of human consciousness. Einstein agreed that beauty only existed if there was a human there to observe it, but he disagreed with Tagore about truth. Einstein thought truth existed whether or not humans are around to comprehend it. And Tagore pushed him on this. I mean, he was no wallflower at all. He pushed him on this. And Einstein said, I can't explain it, but that is my religion. That is my religion, Einstein said. It's a tremendous, it's a great exchange. Okay, let's move on to number 6. See the world through the eyes of others. Empathy, basically, is what we're talking about. And I think Tagore was hugely empathetic. And, you know, as a writer, I think I don't think you can be a good writer without having empathy, putting yourself in the shoes of others, seeing the world through the eyes of others. And I think the job of a writer is to both make the strange familiar, but also to make the familiar strange. So if I'm describing something that just seems bizarre to me, I'm going to try to explain that in terms that my readers can understand. But the trickier part is to make the familiar strange. And we all get into this rut, right? Where you're living the same life, especially these days, over and over again, and you don't see things fresh. This is one of the benefits of travel, and why I miss it so much is that when you travel, it's not that you change physically or there's something in the energy vortices. I don't necessarily believe that. It's that you suddenly see things fresh. Your senses are heightened. And Tagore, of course, who was from Calcutta, said he would sometimes imagine myself a foreigner, and only then do I discover how much is to be seen. So he'd walk around the streets of Calcutta and imagine himself as a foreigner, and then he would see things that that he otherwise missed. And this is a helpful exercise. And I suggest you, if you're in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, or London, or Beijing, or wherever you are, tomorrow go out and look at that city or that town through the eyes of an outsider, as if you're seeing it for the first time. And I want to talk briefly about the connection between immigrants and genius, because a city like Calcutta or Vienna in 1900 or Athens or any of these places, one thing that made them these genius clusters is because they were crossroads of different ideas converging and different peoples. In Calcutta, it was British and Bengali and Muslim and Hindu culture all colliding, right? And statistically, immigrants are more likely to be geniuses than other people. And why is that? Well, one reason is that they're hungry, they want to succeed, but that explains why they work hard. It doesn't explain that creative breakthrough. And I think that immigrants, the reason is that they see things differently in this way that Tagore is speaking about. They are become a sort of insider-outsider. They have enough outside perspective to see things freshly, but they're insiders enough that they can change the system. You don't want to be too far outside. You want to be an insider-outsider. And Tagore was very much that his whole life. Not quite fully Indian, not quite fully Western, yet somehow more than both, not less. Okay, let's move on to number 7, do something, right? So it's easy to look at these pictures of Tagore and say, oh, he was a philosopher, he was a poet, he sat around, he didn't do much, he just thought big thoughts and wrote beautiful poetry. He did those things, but he did something. He said, and I love this quote, men of action shape their own lives. They fashion the rhythm of their lives. Today would say people of action. Men and women of action shape their own lives. They fashion the rhythm of their lives. And that was Tagore. And I love this quote, you can't cross the sea merely by standing and staring at the water. And how many of us, myself included, find ourselves doing that? You know, if only the water, let's analyze the water. Let's do a master's thesis on the water. Let's get a second master's degree about the water. No, just cross the sea, get out on the water. So Tagore is doing things. He's holding meetings. He's an activist. He's an essayist. He's a dramatist. He's a poet. He's a painter, as we'll learn. And he's a musical composer. He composes some 2,000-3,000 songs, today known as Rabindranath Sangeet, which is the songs of Tagore, essentially. And you walk around Calcutta and you can see them in music shops, the CDs for sale. You can literally hear Rabindranath Sangeet, the songs coming out of the speakers and street crossings. Tagore did things. And the thing he did that he's best known for is this poem, as Arup said, the Gitanjali, which means song offering. And this is the actual manuscript. You know, it's a little bit of English, a little bit of Bengali. I'll just read it for you. This is my delight, thus to wait and watch at the wayside where shadow chases light and the rain comes in the wake of the summer. All poetry is hard to translate. I wish I read and spoke Bengali so that I could appreciate Tagore in the original. So this poem is read by William Butler Yeats, the famous Irish poet. And he becomes a champion of Tagore's, starts spreading the gospel of Tagore around London. And this book is printed, the poems, the Gitanjali is printed, and it becomes hugely popular. And before you know it, Tagore is an international celebrity, the first literary international celebrity. And he wins the Nobel Prize, the first Asian, the first non-Westerner, the first non-European other than Teddy Roosevelt to win the Nobel Prize. This was in 1915, and it's a tremendous honor. But I want to ask you a question, if we can pull up the next poll question. Let's say that you were granted an honor like Tagore was after he won the Nobel Prize. He is, I think he won it in 1913, actually. He is knighted by King George V. So he becomes Sir Rabindranath, I guess you would say, if we can bring up that poll question. Let's see if we have that. Do we have the poll question? There we go. Okay, you've been knighted by the Queen of England. I wrote this before the latest controversies over the Queen of England. It is a great honor. Trust me, it was. Under which circumstances would you return the award? A, if I felt I was not deserving of it. B, if the British government did something I found morally offensive. C, if a similar award was given to my sworn enemy. Or D, if I couldn't do a proper British accent. So you've been knighted by the Queen of England. It's a great honor. Under what circumstances would you renounce it, essentially, renounce this honor? And I'll wait for your answer. Give it some thought. So what would it take for you to return the award? Thought you weren't deserving of it? British government did something you found morally offensive? Similar words given to your sworn enemy? Couldn't do a proper British accent? And well, through the magic of poll zooming, we should have the results up very soon. And there we go. 10% said if you're not deserving of it. Okay, 88% must have known this story because you all got it right. After the Amritsar massacre in 1919, Tagore renounces the award and says he doesn't want to thank you, but thank you very much. But he wins a lot of money for the prize, and he uses it to start his school in Shantiniketan, a lovely place, a couple hours north of outside of Calcutta. Beautiful setting. I visited it myself. It means peaceful abode, essentially. And he begins this school. Now, the thing about Tagore is he was, as I said, a bad student. As he said, the tastiest tidbit may not be relished when thrown at one's head. And as a young man, all this knowledge is thrown at his head. He particularly hated English lessons, by the way. So he thought that the role of educators of schools was not to explain things, but to stoke curiosity and wonder in the child. So he's got all this prize money from, and all this fame from winning the Nobel Prize. So he wants to start a school that's modeled after the Indian tapavans, or forest colonies, where people would go off in the woods to learn. So all the classes at Shantiniketan were, and I believe still are, to a large extent, held outside in an atmosphere of living aspiration and inspiration, said Tagore. There was, I believe, not much great in the way of grading. They were not interested in how you were doing. And it was very international. In fact, the name of the school means bringing India to the world, and the world to India. Tagore was what I call a wisdom forager. He thought knowledge could be valuable no matter where it comes from. You judge it by its value, not by its source. And it was a mix of East and West. And the great Bengali film director, Socrates Express, said he went to school in Shantiniketan. He said, Shantiniketan made me the combined product of East and West that I am. So now Tagore is running a school, and it is still a beautiful place. And if you can get there, get there. It lives up to its name, Abode of Peace. It may not be the most prestigious school, university in India. I'll be honest about that. The art school is quite good, but it started a very innovative way, pioneered an innovative way of educating, of teaching. Number 8, make mistakes. Now, this might seem odd, given a life lesson from Tagore. What mistakes did he make? He was this famous Nobel Prize winner. He made lots of mistakes. His early poetry, he described himself as like a young deer which butts here, there, and everywhere with its newly sprouting horns. I made myself a nuisance with my budding poetry. He made mistakes. He was always revising himself. Any writer worth their salt knows the first revision is never the final revision. But he was prolific. He produced a lot. You know, and the chemist and scientist Linus Pauling, 2-time Nobel Prize winner, was once asked, you know, a young student said, Dr. Pauling, how do you produce so many brilliant ideas? He said, it's easy. I come up with lots of ideas and I throw away the bad ones. And that was sort of Tagore, you know, 28 volumes of poetry, drama, all these songs. They're not all equally good, but he keeps producing them. and revising them. And I wouldn't say he embraced his mistakes, but he riffed off of them. You know, the doctor and author Oliver Sacks wrote a book where in one of his books, he writes about a drummer with Tourette's syndrome who would be drumming away, making mistakes here and there because of his Tourette's. But sometimes he'd hit the cymbal and he'd riff off of that and go and improvise in that direction. And I think that's a similar way that Tagore treated his mistakes, as departure points for more. And what he says here is quite true. We come nearest to the great when we are great in humility. And I skipped ahead here. Sorry. If you everything he says is true. If you shut your door to all errors, truth will be shut out. So that's his approach, is you've got to make mistakes and you've got to sort of embrace that. Let's move on to number 9. Stay humble. Again, might seem surprising because he wasn't really humble. If you met him, you would think that he was kind of arrogant. Many people did. He had the confidence to achieve what he did, but he also knew what he didn't know. As he said about his English, I know English well enough to know that I do not know it. Very much like Socrates that way, and that he knew that ignorance is the driver of knowledge. If you think you know everything, you're going to learn nothing. And so he was comfortable with, this is a very Indian thing, I think, with ambiguity. This is from Amit Chaudhry, a contemporary Bengali writer, writing on Tagore, says, Tagore devoted so much of his gift to describing what is half understood, partially grasped, unclear, or ambiguous. He is a poet of uncertainties and absences. And that requires a certain humility. We come nearest to the great when we are great in humility. Tagore didn't feel that it was him alone producing these things. As he said of his paintings, he said, it is I who put a first stroke on the canvas, but it is he who filled it with colors I did not possess. Sort of a team effort with the divine. And we're going to wrap up here in a minute. We're going to go to number 10. Never stop learning. Never stop learning. Let's poll question number 4 quickly, please. Because you're probably not thinking about the question of retirement right now, if I know you. But I'd like you to give it some thought and think about at what age you would retire. When is the right time to retire, would you say? And we're waiting for the poll question to come up. When do you see yourself retiring? At age 65? B, at age 70? C, as soon as I have enough money to do so comfortably? D, never. Do, 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 do. Do, 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 do. Do, 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 do. Okay, we're gonna wait for the answer. And it's no right or wrong answer, just, be honest. When do you see yourself retiring? And we'll wait for the answer here. It's pretty amazing that we can tap into the mind so much. Okay, 71% of you said never. And I think that's my answer, and that was Tagore's answer. At age 60, he takes up painting for the first time, again, stemming from his doodles. Paints some 2,000 paintings, 2,000 paintings, and they're good. If that isn't bad enough, they're good. He's at age 60 and he's working into his 70s and 80s, and he's traveling. And I was thinking, what sort of, from Hindu scripture, sort of sums up Tagore? There's so much wisdom in the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and all these places. Like what sums up Tagore and his life? And I thought this does. It's a pretty famous line from the Rig Veda, ancient book. We're going back many thousands of years. Truth is one, the wise call it by many names. I think that speaks to Tagore's life and to the lessons we learn. So he saw everything as connected. Truth is one. He didn't see any of these projects he engaged in, whether it was poetry or activism or philosophy or being an educator as that different. They're just part of the one. He's just calling them by different names. And this is true of all geniuses. Einstein played the violin, and that informed his science. Freud was interested in archaeology. The Renaissance man and woman needs to absorb, I think, this wisdom. And I could end there, but I want to end on a kind of mellow note, which is this quote from Tagore: "The butterfly counts not months, but moments, and has time enough." So he's a myriad-minded man, as he's been called. He's engaged in all these activities. He's not retiring. He's taking up painting. He's writing poems. He's founding a school. He's meeting with Einstein and Gandhi. Yet he also had the capacity to do nothing. And that's not easy. It's harder now in our day probably than it was his. I think even if Tagore were alive today and he had email and everything, he would shut things off. I have a program on my computer called the Freedom Program, which disconnects me from the internet for anywhere from 15 minutes to 8 hours. Freedom was a big deal for Tagore, the freedom to think and to create. And I think he would want the freedom to do nothing as well. He spent a lot of time on a houseboat, his family houseboat and other houseboats. He would do a lot of writing as the boat sort of just floated down the rivers and lakes of West Bengal and other parts of the world. The butterfly counts not months, but moments, and has time enough. And unfortunately, we do not have time enough. So I'm going to wrap up my formal presentation there and turn it over to Heather, I believe, so we can take some of your questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Eric. Again, we'll use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, so you can go ahead and type your questions in there. And as Eric indicated, Heather Christine will be posing those questions. As you're going ahead and typing those in, I'd like to just take a moment to introduce the president of Moravian College, Brian Grigsby, to say a few words.
Hi, Eric. Thank you. Thank you very much for your great talk. And it was a pleasure to have you at Moravian. Greatly appreciate it. Sorry for the IT confusion, as I was the chief of staff. People couldn't find where I was, but I appreciate you coming to Moravian.
No,
as you
my
may
pleasure.
or may not know, Moravian's the 6th oldest college, and the Moravians were historic travelers back in a time when even traveling wasn't that common. So this lecture was fantastic, and they were lifelong learners, just like Tagore. I thank Arup again. Great gratitude for introducing us to this lecture, introducing us to the literature, introducing us to new scholars, and expanding our horizons. We are so appreciative of this. And so I'd like to open up to the questions and answers, because I know a lot of people are here and they want to learn a lot more about this. But I welcome all of you to Moravian College. And next year, we hope to do this physically on campus, where we can see one another and not have IT problems as we negotiate a pandemic. So great. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you.
So Eric, we have a question from someone that says, can you speak to Tagore's influence on women's rights?
I don't know if he was specifically an advocate for women's rights. He was an advocate for human rights and for all rights. And I know that women were welcome at the university in Shantiniketan. I think at an earlier date that they may have been elsewhere in India. I would just say that he was an advocate for all rights, including women, and he welcomed women to his school. And a lot of the protagonists in his short stories and his novels were women, and they tended to be strong women and strong characters. You know, the first novel to be written in English in India or in any language came out of Calcutta. And the first woman to write a book in India was also in Calcutta, probably just before Tagore's time. I forget the name of the book and the woman, but there was a lot of groundbreaking going on in Calcutta just before and during Tagore's time.
Thank you. Another question is, what is the dialect the Tagore family developed that you mentioned, and can you elaborate?
My understanding is it's called Dakurabari or something to that effect. I don't think it was its own language. I think they had their own affectations and their own way of speaking. Maybe dialect's a bit strong, but this was a world unto itself at Jorasanko. And they did have their own way of speaking and their own way of dressing. Tagore dressed, you've seen these long flowing robes he wore. He dressed like no one else, literally. I mean, it was a Tagore look, and he was original that way. He was the original, I'm not sure what the Bengali word for fashionista is, but he was a fashionista.
Thank you. So what would Tagore say to people today to comfort and guide us?
He would say, chill. This has happened before. It happened during my time. I experienced the suffering. You will get through this, and you might get through this in some ways better and stronger than ever. He was an optimist, and he would look for the opportunities here, and look always for ways to bring the world together. And, you know, again, the term wisdom forager is one I think that really applies to him. And he would use this time to find little gems of wisdom out there in the world and share them with people.
Another question is, what pragmatic steps can be taken to popularize Tagore's humanistic philosophy globally?
You know, that's a tough one. I think, I'll be honest here, Tagore has suffered from an excess of fame and then a dearth of fame in the West, I'm talking about. In Calcutta, he's always been adored, right? But Yeats comes along, quote unquote, discovers Tagore as if he needed discovering, and he presents him to the West, and he becomes the cause célèbre, and then he falls out of favor decades later. So, you know, I don't know, other than, you know, translating new translations of his works might help. It's hard to translate poetry in particular. Talks like these help. I think, you know, just reaching out to people to say, hey, there was, you know, if you have to piggyback off his Nobel Prize, so be it. He was the first non-Westerner to win the Nobel Prize for anything. That's a big deal. And I don't know why more people around the world don't know the name Tagore. They know the name Gandhi. So I would say just keep holding events like this and spreading the word.
Another question, how do we bring Tagore's lessons to bring his philosophy into modern politics?
Modern politics. Ooh, tricky question. So Tagore was wary of nationalism and of excessive patriotism. And I'm going to get a little political here because he would say it's the right thing to do. He would probably be wary of some of the trends in India right now, the Hindutva movement as it's known. He'd be wary of some of the trends in America. He felt that, I'm going to quote him here, and I'm going to probably butcher it, but something to the extent he said, if you make your God, if you make your country a god, you put a curse on it. So he was really, in a way, the first global citizen. He was Indian through and through, but he saw the dangers of excessive patriotism and nationalism, and idolizing your country and making it a god. He thought that was the worst thing you could do for yourself and for your country in the long run.
Another question is, what piqued your interest in Tagore's work, and what was your first experience with his writing, painting, or song?
So when I was living in India, I lived in India for a few years as NPR's Delhi correspondent. I was vaguely aware of Tagore, but I was in Delhi and he was off in Calcutta, and I was vaguely aware of him and his place in Indian culture. But then I'm researching this book, The Geography of Genius, and I'm looking for genius clusters around the world. And I thought, well, they can't all just be in the West, Athens, Florence, other places, Vienna. And I happen on Hangzhou, China, which in the 13th century was an incredible place of genius. And then I happened across the phrase, the Bengal Renaissance, which I had not seen before. And that piqued my interest. The Bengal Renaissance, what is that? And I started, as I do with everything, with place. I started to read about Calcutta in the 19th century. And Tagore is just the brightest light in this huge constellation of stars. So my interest in Tagore came through my interest in these genius clusters and in the city of Calcutta.
Thank you. Following up on that, if Tagore were alive today, what is one question you would like to ask him?
Oh, that's a good one. Where can I get an outfit like that? Because it's looking cool. That would be one question. That's a really good one. I would be interested in his thoughts on technology, I think, and finding, I'd be curious what he thinks about like the way we're communicating now, about email, about text messaging, because he was, unlike Gandhi, much more of an advocate, or at least not an opponent to Western technology. I'd be curious how he would suggest we find some balance in our lives. Would he be all in with Slack and chatting and texting, or would he really want to tune out and go on his houseboat for a while? And how would he suggest that we find balance in our lives?
Somebody's asked if there are a collection of his works in English available.
Oh, yeah. Collection, shelves full. A lot in English. On the 150th anniversary of his birth, they came out with The Essential Tagore, which is a great compilation and place to start with all his works. But the Gitanjali, his most famous poem, is certainly available in English in many translations. Many of his novels are in English. There's a lot. You could start with The Essential Tagore and go from there, but he's definitely been translated.
There's been a follow-up comment that there should be a Hollywood movie made about Tagore's life today.
There should. There should. Because it goes back to that question before about how can you popularize Tagore and his writings. 2 words, Steven Spielberg, just get Spielberg or someone to do a movie about him. And, it could be one of these artsy or Merchant Ivory films, or it could be a Hollywood blockbuster, but it's, definitely, it's a life story that lends itself to the Hollywood treatment. That's a great idea.
The last question we're going to ask is, did Tagore's work drive social change in India?
Did Tagore's work drive social change? I'm not so sure if it drove social change, or is it accelerated it. It's a tough question, because unlike Gandhi, that was not his main area that he was focused on. He was a poet, I think, first and foremost. If you had to give him one title, it would be poet. And the rest, I think, stemmed from that. So the question then is, are poets interested in social change? Are they interested in providing some beauty, supplying beauty into the world, and making us stop and think? And Tagore certainly brought a lot of beauty into the world with his poetry and his other works. He certainly made us stop and think, as I hope my talk made you stop and think. If that led to social change, I think he would approve of it. I don't think it was his raison d'etre. He didn't set out with writing a poem saying, I'm going to write this poem so it changes X, Y, or Z in India. I think this, whatever social change came out of his work was a happy byproduct. And that's why I think it is for all writers, poets, and others. You know, we're not necessarily interested in changing the world. At least I know I'm not. What my goal is to make people stop and think, to see more clearly, to look at the world a bit differently, to help people see the world through the eyes of a poet and a traveler. And I hope you got a taste of that this evening.
Thank you. There's been a lot more questions in the Q&A and the chat that unfortunately we are not able to get to. I just put my email address in the chat. If anybody is interested in receiving a copy of tonight's recording, please email me and I will be sure that you receive it if you didn't pre-register. Eric, I just want to thank you for tonight's lecture. You opened our eyes and gave us a lot of things to think about going forward. So
excellent.
Appreciate your time with us this evening.
Namaskar, everyone, to the Indians out there. Bahut dhanyavad for your time, and to everyone else, thank you very much. And read Tagore. Go, even better yet, be Tagore. Go out and write a poem this evening or do something like that. Go float on a houseboat. Thank you.
And now we're going to turn it back over to Daniel Jasper to close us out.
Great. Thank you, Heather. And thank you very much, Eric. It was a wonderful presentation. I think it gave us much to think about and some tools to start to see the world in new ways. So thank you for that. I also want to thank everyone for attending tonight. We appreciate you taking the time and spending it with us at Moravian this evening. Please be sure to visit the website of moravian.edu/Tagore to find out information on next year's lecture. And again, we hope that will be in person next year. Again, thank you all for attending, and thank you especially to Eric Weiner. Good evening, everyone.